Without further ado, let me go ahead and officially welcome everyone to the first PodOps workshop of the new year. I am really excited to welcome Ty as our special host. He is the co-founder of the Arkansas Podcast Collaborative, which is a nonprofit that champions podcasters. And through his initiatives like Arcast Podcast Festival and his work producing the Impactful Podcast Long-Term and Smart Justice, he brings a unique blend of storytelling, advocacy, and community support to the world of podcasting. So please join me in welcoming Ty as our host.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Take it away.
Awesome. We're doing this like I'm a guest on a podcast or something. Like, thanks. How are you?
Gotta keep it comfortable, right?
Right, for sure. All right. Well, thank you guys. I'm going to share my screen for a moment. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yep, we got it.
Rob? Okay, great. Awesome. Yeah, thank you guys for having me for sure. Rob's been great working with, and of course, what PodOps is doing. I think there's a huge market for this platform, and the fact that you're giving this information out to people to freely use and to grow themselves is amazing, and that's what we're all about. So a little bit about what Arkansas Podcast Collaborative is. Yes, we are located in the state of Arkansas. You may have forgotten that exists, and that's perfectly okay. But we don't just serve Arkansas. It's just because that's where we are currently located. There's a lot of potential here. There's also a lot of things that we have to overcome here. And podcasting itself being an industry where the barrier to entry is so low that there is no reason that someone can't come in and help champion the creators that we have in the area, not just here, but in the South. And then, of course, podcasters across the United States who need help with their projects. And so we, up until this year, were the only nonprofit for podcasters. And so we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We provide free coaching resources. We have a membership where we help walk people through the process of planning for their podcast, editing their podcast, presenting their podcast, and of course, posting and repeating, and then getting their marketing off the ground. So we teach and speak at conferences across the United States. Of course, where I met Rob was a podcast movement in Washington, D.C. Host an annual podcast festival called Arcast, and that's where we bring in podcasters from across the United States who have a variety of different expertise to come and talk and share what they've learned on their journey in podcasting with our crowd. We help podcasters get grant funding. That's another thing. That's what we're here to talk about today. So, and in this workshop, so what we're going to learn about, we've got less than an hour. So I'm going to try to move through this kind of quickly, but also just give you the meat and potatoes of what this is all about and what to know, and sort of bust some of those myths that you've heard about grants. So we're going to learn about what to know about grants, of course, just to set the ground, setting a podcast budget, the grants process, grants research, applying for the grants, and then when you're asked to present your idea, what do you do? After getting the grant, what do you do, and what did they get out of it? Okay, so Q&A after. So if you can go ahead and send questions as we go along, and Rob will collect those, and then he'll go ahead and save those up for the end, and then I'll get to those answering those questions at the end. So, all right, so what to know about grants? Grants are funds that have been set aside by individuals or organizations for projects that improve the individual or organization's mission and vision. So there are hundreds of thousands of nonprofit organizations across the United States. There are also government grants that are available. There are individual grants that are available. And so there's lots of money that's sitting out there on the table, but not a whole lot of people know about it. And they also don't let it be known very well because they don't want everybody applying, for this money. Anytime somebody walks in the room and sets down a stack of, $100 bills on the table and say, this is up for anybody that proposes the best idea, well, you're going to get a whole lot of people at the table. So they try not to advertise too much about grants. That way it kind of cuts down on the flow of how many people actually apply for the grant. And so they're kind of hard. There's a hunting process in order to find these grants, but these funds range from a few $100s to millions of dollars, and depending on the funding available and the size of the project. So each one of those nonprofit organizations I was talking about, each one of them has a mission and a vision for the organization itself. And if you're presenting a project that helps them move the needle on that mission and vision, They want to help get you funding so that you can create that project and then they can attach their name to it. Okay, so some of the largest grant givers, for example, are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations. Imagine that. Some of the richest people in the world have a foundation where they can give out grants for a lot of money. And so they give out millions every year. The Ford Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, those are just three of, like I said, hundreds of thousands, and all of them have a different varying amounts of budget that they have for grants that they have to give every year. All right. What to know about grants. So unlike loans, so grants are funds that don't have to be repaid as long as the guidelines are being followed. There are tons of grants available from state, national, and even international organizations. There are also individuals who distribute grants. And we've already covered that, how there's all this money that's sitting on the table, but not a lot of people advertising that it is out there for you. The way I liken it's because I'm such, in that entrepreneur mindset, I run and operate a small business too. So like, I think of it in these terms, where a grant is kind of like that initial injection of cash that you need to start up your business, right? So it's always recommended that you have, $10,000 in startup money anytime you start a small business, because you got to register with your Secretary of State, you've got to have your business license, you've got to have, if you're selling a product, you got to have supplies and you stock up on all the things that you're selling. If you're selling a digital, anyway, so there's lots of different things that you need initial injections of cash for so that you can start your business so that you can be able to start raising money, right? So the same thing for podcasts. This is how grants work. So grants are giving you a lump sum of money, and it's not going to last forever. It is definitively in this amount of money that they agreed to give you. And you've got a limited time of, a window of time to spend that money. And then there's no guarantee that you're going to get money after that. So what you want to do with that money, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, once you're given a grant, you want to be smart in how you spend that. Now, one, you're going to have to propose a budget to them. And then you're going to have to hold yourself to that budget, but also plan for how am I going to keep this project, my podcast, how am I going to keep this funded afterwards? You know what I mean? There are lots of ways to do that. And we'll talk about a few of those, including, subscriptions on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and monetizing on YouTube and getting sponsors. And so there's lots of ways to set yourself up for continuing to make money. But grants are great because they give you that initial injection of cash that you need to get into a position to where you can start doing that. Okay. Many grants are available. They're not all made public knowledge. Most of the ones that are listed publicly have specified specific needs that they want to be filled. Podcasts are rarely, if ever, mentioned in the description of a grant, but that doesn't mean that it excludes podcasts. In fact, that part of the leverage that you're going to have by the end of this workshop. So lots of the grants that you find online, let's say you jump on Google and you say grants for podcasts, you're not going to find a whole lot of results that actually are relevant to what you're looking for. But if you say grants available, hundreds of thousands, even millions of results are going to shop up, and you're not going to be able to discern which ones are best for you. So there are a few websites that we will cover and look at that do list grants, and a lot of them you have to subscribe to even get access to them. But a lot of people just post their grants that are available on their websites. But you will rarely ever see any of the listings or descriptions for applying that say that they are looking for a podcast. So they will say, we are looking for programming, or we are looking for educational opportunities, or we are looking for projects. Those are keywords that you're looking for because those are so non-specific that podcasting right now, of course, we all know that it's on an uprise. And I think this year is going to be even bigger for podcasting itself in the industry. More and more organizations want a podcast to be associated with their name. They want to sponsor, but they don't know where to start. And it's much easier to help you and your podcast keep going because you already have an expertise. If you're already established podcaster, or you have an audience that you can reach that they're trying to reach, it's much easier for them to fund you and your project than for them to put together a team in-house and try to produce their own podcast when they're starting from scratch and they don't know anything about it. So there's a huge appeal to having a podcast already, and you're making it easier for them to move the needle on that mission and vision. Plus they get, a little bit of advertising out of attaching their name to your podcast. So it's a win-win situation for everybody. So to put it simply, do podcasters get grants? Oh, absolutely. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of grants that are available out there. A lot of podcasters don't realize that they are available, because when you go to, let's say, some of these events, if you go to Podfest, or if you go to Podcast Movement, or any of the big podcast festivals, or any workshops, and you ask people, how do I get funding for my podcast? The number one answer you're going to hear is sponsors. Get sponsors, and then the next one is monetize. The next one is try to get subscriptions on your podcast itself, or get a Patreon. And those are all really good answers, and those work really well for a lot of people. But there are also some really great grants out there, and the people that are recommending that you get sponsors don't really realize that those funds for grants are available, or they just don't understand how to get a grant. Just because a grant listing does not specifically say podcast, again, we're just reiterating this, does not mean that it don't apply to podcasts. So podcasts absolutely apply to anything that is, of course, if they're looking for a project or programming. We like to call those sandbox grants, and they're kind of just open for anything. There are tons and tons of grants, of course, that are available out there that are saying we are looking for a classroom setting workshop that's being taught on this. Like, that's completely different than we are looking for projects that help us to reach, impoverished youth and rural communities that have, low access to technology. That's something completely different. The second part, that latter one, is way more apt to be able to give you the funding for a podcast that could reach a community like that. Okay, so setting a budget. We're doing good on time. We're rolling through this. Okay. Much like a small business, like I talked about earlier, a podcast needs to have a budget planned. Your budget depends on the type of the podcast, the length, and who your guests are, several other factors like travel and how much you need help. Okay, so when you are planning for your podcast, I know most of us start off with a one-man show, right? It's you. You're like, I need to start a podcast. I'm going to get it off the ground. But then you realize that it's not just you hosting a podcast. It's you learning how to record a podcast. It's you learning how to edit a podcast. It's you booking the guests, coaching the guests on the way that you want it, figuring it out along the way of, well, that first format I was going with doesn't really quite work. Let's change these things up. You're building your sets if you're doing video, and then you're having to figure out how to run video, how to run audio, how to get the cleanest, the look and sound. But then there's the marketing part, because even if you work really, really, really hard and you're putting blisters on your hands and the amount of work that you're putting into your podcast, still, if it's just sitting on the internet and nothing's being done with the marketing wise, then all that work just kind of doesn't get consumed. It doesn't get listened to, and it can't, because it's not being found. And so there's a lot of marketing work. We have to, social media posts, or making clips for YouTube shorts and reels and TikTok. So there's a lot of work that goes into it besides just hosting a podcast or just starting a podcast. Even if you're an expert, or if you're just a talking head where you're, having conversations with other interesting people, there's a lot of work that goes into podcasting. I know I'm just preaching to the choir here, but just to reiterate of like how much work goes into this. Okay. So think about how much work you were putting into your podcast. And now think about, what if you had a budget to where you could now hire out all of those different positions that you needed? If you could hire a professional editor, if you could hire a professional videographer, or an audio engineer, or if you could hire someone to market or to create clips and to post, your clips of your podcast, to help create flyers, or get you booked on other people's shows, or to get you booked as a speaker at other events. like those are all things that you can include in your budget for your podcast, and including travel. So that also takes care if you're going to one of these big events, that if you're being a speaker, or if you need to travel so that you can record with a guest in person, your gas, your travel, your flying, your hotel, I mean, all of that's included in your travel. So depending on how much all of that is going to cost, because you need to get quotes and all of that, just so you yourself will know, okay, well, if I wasn't doing all this by myself and I had a budget, what would that budget need to be? How much could I hire a really good editor for? How much could I hire someone to market me for? How much would it cost for me to fly to Cincinnati, Ohio, to go interview this really great expert guest that I need to go film? And then to stay there at that hotel, and then like to travel back. How much does it cost for all of this for let's say 9 episodes of one season? Okay. You got to put a definitive number. And then how much would it cost you per episode? And then altogether for your season, make a budget for yourself. And that's just good to know, even if you're not applying for a grant. How much does this cost? And it kind of gives you a visual of, okay, I'm not going to be able to perpetually do this all on my own. It would be nice if I did have somebody to help me in a lot of these areas. But what would it cost to hire all those people? I think you know how much you need to look at for a grant. Okay. Because there's lots of grants that are out there, and they will tell you that the grants is for a range of money. There's not a definitive amount. It won't be for just, this is a $5,000 grant. This is a grant that's up to $5,000. This is a grant that's up to $75,000. This is a grant that's up to $700,000. But depending on what your budget needs are, that doesn't mean that you say, okay, well, there's a grant out here for $700,000, right? It doesn't mean that you set your budget to $700,000. That'd be great. We could probably put out the best product out there and even compete with Joe Rogan at that point. But no, it's you've got to figure out how much would it, cost you to hire these really great talents to help you with your podcast before you apply or find a grant for the amount that you're looking for. So hiring, that you hear that you get what you pay for, right? So there is a range in there too. So you don't want to hire cheap, but you want to hire at a sort of a good mid-level, an even number, somebody that's still hungry for the work. And this is just an extra tip I'm giving you. But if they're really expensive, you don't want them. Those are great for corporations, for people with the disposable income to go and hire. But don't get the really expensive ones. Get the ones who are hungry for it, and then they have something to gain from helping you and to make really good work. That's just a tip again. But anyways, setting that as your budget and being able to look for the funds that are available and grants that fit that budget level. So having a definitive number to work with, so makes it easy to know how much to ask for. That's what we were just talking about. Make a list of equipment, services, marketing that you'll need. And that's another thing. What kind of equipment do you need? And also, what kind of equipment do you already have? A lot of these grants, they will ask you to not ask for the full amount. Let's say that your podcast episode costs, I don't know, if you're hiring editors and videographers and all that stuff, let's say that your podcast episode costs $10,000 for that episode, right? This is a really high-end episode. Okay, well, how much of that equipment do you already have that you could use? Do you have really nice microphones? Do you have a nice camera that you can use? Do you have any lighting that you can use? And so rather than ask for the full $10,000, you want to ask for, maybe $8,000, and then you'll give, in kind, $2,000, which is just using the equipment that you already have. Okay. They're more likely to ask for that so that they're not fully funding everything for your podcast. And it's a way that you sort of meet in the middle, even though they are funding the majority of all the stuff that you need money for. They will pay for that equipment. But they do want you to use whatever you can get. And it's also easy to find other organizations that are nearby saying, hey, I've got this grantor that wants to give me $8,000. We need $2,000 to match. And in return, we'll say, this podcast was brought to you by this organization and these people who donated this. That's all they want. That and listed in the show notes. It's pretty easy to gather that up to fill in the gap of the money that you need. So let's use our example of we have an example budget worksheet that I can send everybody that's here. I'll send that over to Rob so he can share that with you guys to help you sort of get it. It's a spreadsheet to help you get your numbers down of how much everything costs so that you can get the final cost of each one of your episodes. All right, so the grants process. Grants aren't always easy to find, and in fact, the ones worth applying for usually take some time to find. So we use a process. It's called READ. That's what I go by. So it's nothing fancy. It's just research. I mean, it's anything you're trying to learn about, you kind of want to apply this anyway. So research. Look into it. Okay, if we're going to Google it, let's Google it. I'll show you a few different ways of finding grants. But a lot of them that are available, and some of the best ones, are just through networking and being told that those grants are available because they're not listing them on their website or they're hiding them. A lot of state grants are like that. And I think it is because I don't know directly, but I think, my feeling is that I think they do that because they don't want a ton of people applying for those grants. And so they sort of bury them in these, really XML heavy websites where the link always changes and like it's hard to find your place or to apply for it. So there's a lot of grants that are available, but there's some different ways that you can find those grants are available. Number 2, educate yourself on the grantor, the grant itself. Most grants will have a page, sort of a landing page where it's, who does this apply to? What are the parameters of applying? And what are they willing to fund? What are they not willing to fund? Who doesn't apply? So they kind of lay it all out for you so that you can easily, read through maybe a 5-page document, and it sort of delivers you through the whole thing, the whole process of what's available, what's not available, if it fits you or if it doesn't fit you. Number 3, apply for the grant. Pretty easy. And then number 4, deliver what they are funding you for. So let's work through it. Research. Finding grants takes a little research skill, but there isn't one definitive mega website that lists every grant available, sadly. They're scattered across thousands of websites, landing pages, and newsletters. And so here's a few ways of finding some grants. There's Google, but like I said, if you search for podcast grant, you're not going to find very many helpful links. You'll find some links, and maybe you can go down the rabbit hole and find something that fits your format. But let's say that your podcast is about a very specific subject. Let's say that your podcast is talking about historical films, right? Or like the black and white movies from the early 20s or so. Well, there's probably a grant out there for that. You'd be surprised on the things that there are grants available for, by the way. There are so many subject matter. I don't care what it is that you talk about. There's a grant for that. And I've got some surprising ones I'll tell you about in a little bit. But if you look up for grants for, classic film discussion or education, you're going to find a lot of grants that pop up on the Google results that'll help lead you to different organizations that have funded in the past, grants for, maybe it's film preservation, but maybe they just want to talk about, a lot of films. There are plenty, if you go on YouTube, there are plenty of channels and podcasts out there that talk about, the latest movies that are coming to theaters. There aren't a ton of them that really talk about, the older films, right? So there's a grant for that. Instrumental.com is another website, but it is one of those that you have to pay a subscription for, and it is quite pricey because they know that the amount that you're going to get out of the information that they give you, let's say, I think they're, I think it's $6,000 a year, I think, for that subscription. But they know that if you pay $6,000 for their subscription, there's a high chance that you're going to get $30,000 back in a grant money or more, depending on how many grants you apply for. Which, by the way, there is no limit of how many grants you can apply for. Humanities and arts organizations are another good way of finding grants. So every state, if you're in the US, so every state has their own nonprofit organizations and humanities organizations that put out There's sort of seasonal grants, and sometimes it is like a fellowship artist grant, or it's a this also covers like historical societies for your states. And so if you have a podcast that fits any of those things that they list of what they're looking for, or if it has anything to do with the humanities period, which is just humanities can be anything, by the way. It can be about language or society or culture, and culture is just, I mean, that could be two people talking. And arts organizations, they have several grants, and so the seasonal grants are sort of open. It may say that we are accepting applications between September 5th and October 9th or whatever. Like, you have to fit that window. You can't be a day late. You can't be a day early. And if you're looking for these podcasts or these grants and looking for funding for your podcast, then you need to make sure that you have a plan in place of how you're going to put your podcast together. That budget sheet that we were talking about earlier really helps. So GrantWatch is another one. I think GrantWatch, I don't remember if that's free or if it's subscription, but I know that they give you the first maybe 8 of the top of the list anytime you search for a certain area on GrantWatch. So let's say that you're looking for a cosmetology grant, right? Or like education grant. If your podcast is about makeup, that's just one wild example I'm coming up with. It'll give you like maybe the top 8. It won't give you the full information, but it will tell you which organization, or give you some of the wording of the grant that is available. And you can just copy that and paste it into the Google bar, and it'll pull up the grant from the organization on their website so that you can apply right there. And then there's also social media. Don't underestimate the power of people just making a post saying, we have a grant available and applications are open now. Search Facebook, search, of course, not so much on X anymore, but like people will post on, like I've seen organizations post on LinkedIn a lot too. So I'd say LinkedIn, Facebook, those would be like probably the main 2 where you can find grants that are listed. So educate yourself. That's the second part of read. Once you find a few grants that seem like a close fit, read their full descriptions and educate yourself. Okay, who is the grantor? Learn everything you can about that organization. What is their mission and vision? What are they going after? Is it the audience that they're trying to reach? Does that seem to fit your audience? And if it does, even slightly, if there's a Venn diagram there, then there's an argument for why you need the grant. What are they looking for? Is it an educational piece, or is it just programming? Is it research? And there's lots of different ways that people are putting grants and what they want in return for the grant money that's being put out there. So how can I learn as much as possible about that subject? How can my podcast serve this subject? How can my podcast further this organization's mission? And what are the requirements? So basically, we have the organization. We have their mission and vision, everything that they're about, the audience they're trying to reach. We have you and your skills, whether it's an existing podcast you have or a podcast that you want to propose. Where do they meet in the middle? What's the overlap? Is there some sort of audience overlap? Because that's the most useful. Is it the education piece because you're an expert in what the organization wants to do for people? Like recently, I helped a podcaster who has a podcast about helping children go to sleep at night. And it's a kids podcast where these if you look at the album art, they're like cartoonish animals, right? And so these animals are trying to educate kids, and they talk in a very, kid-friendly way, and it puts the kids to sleep at night, and they last, maybe 8 to 10 minutes. And so comparing them or pairing them with a sleep study organization, and it helped them reach a demographic that they have been trying to reach, which is children, but also parents of children who have a hard time going to sleep. And so that was a great match for those two. Okay, and what are the requirements? It'll tell you what they need. There's one big contingent on a lot of these that I'll tell you about, and not all of them. And I won't even see like the majority of them. but a lot of these organizations want what's called a nonprofit fiscal partner. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so some grants require you to have a nonprofit fiscal partner. That's what I just said. How did I know that I was going to say that? This creates a layer of trust between you and the grantor. Okay, so how this works is, let's say that it's a nonprofit organization that has, now I'll give you a real life example of like one recently that we did. So there was an organization in New York, and there was a podcaster in Los Angeles. And Kate Downey, if you've ever heard of her, she works for Wondery, and she had an idea for a new podcast, and it's talking about why is it that there's only 2 doctors in one facility in like Iowa or somewhere that are just completely underfunded, that are studying the effects of women's menstrual cramps and like how to relieve pain, when so many women and girls go to the emergency room every year with so many complications with menstrual cramps. And so that organization agreed to give Kate $75,000 for this grant to produce her podcast. But they wanted a nonprofit fiscal partner to be in between, just meaning that they wanted another nonprofit to be between them and Kate, to be financially responsible, that Kate is going to spend every dollar the way that she proposed to that organization, how she was going to spend it. That if she said that she was going to, pay in total, $12,000 was going to go towards this editor, then all $12,000 needs to go towards that editor. And we're responsible of making sure that she spends that money that way. We can't take a cut of that. We can't take any kind of profit whatsoever. But since we are, a nonprofit organization that just specifically is trying to help more podcasts with a cause, get off the ground, perfectly fits our mission and vision. But technically, any nonprofit could fill that role. But if their main vision and mission isn't podcasting like ours is, then it's kind of hard to get them to be financially or fiscally responsible in the way, or applying the amount of attention that you need, right? So if the American Cancer Association is your nonprofit fiscal partner in between, they're not really focused on the podcast, right? So it's hard to get answers, and the communication piece sort of falls apart in between. So that's what we try to do, is provide that for the industry, is be that financial fiscal partner in between that can focus purely on you and your podcast and getting that organization what they need from your podcast. So applying, once you have educated yourself and can clearly see how your podcast can serve the needs of the grant, it's time to write it out in full detail. So why are you proposing this podcast? And this is good for you, again, just as a podcaster, period. Even if you don't want to apply for a grant, it's good to have a one sheet. Why are you doing a podcast? What's the format? What's it about? Who does it serve? How many episodes? What's the timeline? How fast are you producing these episodes? How fast are you putting them out? If it's a weekly show, does that mean that you're recording weekly, or that you're going to record a whole lot of episodes and then you're going to release them weekly at a later time? How long of a window from the start of planning this podcast until you put out the very last episode? How long is that process going to be? And just work out the logistics of everything about your podcast. It's not too hard, but it's something that, surprisingly, a lot of podcasters do not think about. They just think, well, I'm going to put out an episode weekly, so I'm just going to record, edit real quick, put it up, post it, and then tell everybody, hey, go listen to my latest episode, and then I'm done. But they're not really thinking of a window. If it's an ongoing podcast where you don't have seasons, then that's perfectly fine. But why are you doing the podcast, for one? And then who is it for? What do they benefit from the podcast? And why should they listen to yours of all the podcasts that are out there on that subject? And it really helps you define your voice and your purpose. I mean, it's the same thing as a business, right? So this is basically the summary of your business plan. But it also tells people and yourself, reminds you, who is this podcast for? Who does it benefit? Why do they need to listen to you? Also, if you have that information, it's easy to convince other organizations why they should be helping fund your podcast if you know exactly who it is that you serve. When applying for grants, make sure that you have a limited number of episodes. That's what I was saying. So a season of 6 to 10 episodes is perfectly reasonable. So even if you're not doing, well, there's several ways to go about this. So if you do a new show, let's say that you're starting a brand new podcast, but you've got podcast experience and you can show, hey, I've been doing this show for 3 years. I have garnered this many listens, this many downloads. I've gotten this feedback, and this is the audience that I serve. I can start a new podcast for your grant for this amount, and this is who you're going to have direct reach to, because I've already tapped into that market or that audience, right? That demographic, they listen to me. That is my audience. If I start a new show, tell them to come listen to this new show. They will listen to that show. That's why you should fund my podcast. Making sure there's a definitive number, because that grant, like I said, is a limited amount of money. And so being sure that that money is spent on a limited amount of episodes is really important, because if you get, we'll say that 75,000, right? If Kate hadn't said that this is going to be a 9 episode season, then it's just a perpetual, ongoing podcast. Then how far would that $75,000 get you? Probably just to the 9 episodes, because that's what you put the budget out there for, right? So the cost per episode doesn't change just because you don't put a cap on it. You're just going to run out of money at some point. So the organizations want to make sure that there is a limited number of episodes that they are funding you for, and then we can pull data from it afterwards, right? How many listens did we get? How many downloads did we get? What was the audience that we reached? That type of thing. But if you already have an ongoing, podcast where you already have that audience's attention, it's kind of a harder sell. But you can say that, well, I'm going to start in this new season. I've already got 8 seasons out, but on season 9, we really want to tackle this subject, and your grant seems perfect for that, and we seem perfect for your grant. But here's why you should sponsor season 9 with your grant. And it doesn't change the amount of money that's needed, but their funding for that grant is only for that limited amount of episodes that's going to be in that season. Hopefully that makes sense. So delivery, last part of this is delivering once you have a grant. If you're awarded a grant, it is a commitment to deliver what you promised. The funding is for what you have proposed, and the grantor expects to see what you do with it. This is a reason why grantors prefer the non-fiscal partnerships in between. And the reason why they choose nonprofit fiscal partners to be in between is because they have something to lose. I know Rob just went through this, but it is a process to get a nonprofit started. You've got to go through your Secretary of State. You've got to fill out a lot of forms and jump through a lot of hoops with the IRS, and even to get that 501c3 status. There's a lot on the line. If we mess this up, then our credibility goes out the window and we lose our status with the IRS. And then we're not able to open the nonprofit again. Like, we're just done for if we mess up. Okay. So that's why they want somebody with such a high, something to lose in between, rather than say, here's stranger that applied for our grant. Here's $75,000. Now, hopefully you produce whatever we agreed on with this grant. Rather than have that, they want that nonprofit that has the something to lose to be in between. And so we're being financially responsible. We are making sure that, let's say, Kate is spending every dollar the way that she needs to, and then we're reporting back to the organization, hey, everything's on task. We're good to go. We are still going to be able to deliver the last episode on this date as we promised. And the only thing those organizations really want in return, they won't ask for a whole lot. And every organization is different, of course, like the one that we did for Kate, right? So they just pretty much handed over the $75,000, and then they were like, well, good luck and let us know how it works out. Other organizations will be way more specific in saying, okay, after this is over, let's do, a sort of an ROI, look at this. Okay, we spent this much with a grant. How many listeners did we get? What audience did we hit? Are there any other factors or demographic numbers or anything else that we can pull from this? What data can we pull from this to know that what effects this project had on people? Was it worth it for us or was it not? And that will pretty much determine if they're going to either give a grant like that out again, or if they want to fund or continue to fund your project, which we'll talk about. And that's called underwriting. But yeah, so this your commitments to deliver is you're agreeing under contract for this grant. You're saying this money is for this. You're making the show. You're putting the show out, and that's all you're held to. You don't, if you make any extra money, this is another side. So let's say that you, in that process, let's say your season is going to come out over the course of 6 months. Okay. So in that 6 months, if you get any additional sponsors, or if you find a way to sell merch, or if you do have a Patreon where people can subscribe for a longer episode or to get episodes earlier, or if you do have a subscription model on Apple or Spotify, or if you have any way of making money, period, from the podcast, that nonprofit organization that gave you the money doesn't affect, it's not affected whatsoever. They don't want a cut of your money. They're not asking for that. All they're doing is giving you money for the thing that you said that you needed the money for. So make sure you spend that amount of money on that. Any other additional money that you make, that's yours. And that's great. And that's what you need to be doing. You need to be finding out ways to continue to fund your podcast while you're in that phase of spending that grant money. Presenting your proposal. So sometimes when you write your proposal and it sounds great, so you've got their attention, right? You say, I've already got the attention of the audience that you're trying to reach. They want to hear more for your project, either in person or a video call. A lot of times they'll just, they'll be, either a group or conference call. A lot of these organizations, they're not very, how to put this, tech savvy. So like a lot of them are ran by older people who are trying their best with technology, but there's a reason why they haven't started the podcast on their own, right? There's a reason why they would rather fund other projects that are already working with technology rather than trying to learn themselves. So a lot of them will just have you on a conference call or a Zoom call. If it's really fancy, then there'll be a video call. Or sometimes if it's a local organization and that's local to you, they'll ask you to come in person, but then there'll also be a video option. But anyways, it'll basically just be a meeting where they want you to present your idea in person. They want to hear from you. Make sure you're an actual person, for one. But two, they want to hear about the passion that you have for this project that you've proposed. Did you just write something up in ChatGPT, or do you really feel heartfelt about the subject matter that you said you were going to talk about, or for this grant project? And the amount of emotion and your personal attachment that you have to the project really depends on whether they're going to say, okay, yeah, we're going to grant this. We're going to give you the funding because you sound like you really are serious about this. And so that's really what those meetings are for. At that point, basically they've already said yes. They just want to make absolutely sure that you are going to be committed to this project. So be prepared. This isn't Shark Tank. So you're not going to have to know like specific numbers or like say, if we put out 2 episodes, we'll have this many listeners, because they know. I mean, like everybody knows, you can't guarantee how many listeners you're going to have on a podcast, right? Whenever you put it out there, you hope. And sometimes it really works and overshoots your expectations, and sometimes it's really low. And sometimes it takes a few more episodes before it even catches anyone's attention. But they are not looking for those types of numbers. They're just looking for how much passion do you have when you speak about the project? What is your personal attachment to that? As an added bonus, working on refining your idea for a podcast, like a lot of these things that we were just talking about, the one sheet, the budget sheet, while you're helping yourself niche down on your own content. It's helping you understand yourself better, your show better, why you're doing it, who it's for. And that helps you in your content. No matter if you never get funded, you still have a way better idea of how to create your show. And when creating your show and putting it out there in the world, you're giving more of an opportunity for more people to find it because you're niching down. And so it's a great side effect of preparing yourself to apply for any of these grants. Just my examples. And so, okay, so we have to adjust your podcast a little bit, your idea. Let's say, we'll give you an example here, but whenever you read on the requirements of the grant that this amount of money is available, but we, specifically cater to this type of audience, right? And they'll put the parameters down. Learn about the organization. So the idea, okay, so you have a podcast that interviews interesting personalities near you. I think this is the most common type of podcast that I've ever seen in the world, right? Where it's the talking heads, two people just having a conversation. You're the host, and your role is to be the most unknowing person in the world because you just constantly just ask the other person questions. Well, what do you do for a living? Oh, it's amazing. How did you start that? Oh, okay. Well, how do you tackle this issue? Well, how do you feel about this? Oh, can you talk more about that? And so you're just constantly asking questions of your guests. They're getting to talk about whatever their expertise is. You see those types of podcasts pop up all the time, and they're easy. They're easy to create. It's easy to get guests booked, but I would say the market is definitely flooded with those. Let's say that the grant is for the State Archive wants to put projects that focus on preserving historical stories for rural communities together. Okay. This is just, they will be that specific. So change your idea. A podcast that interviews elders in the rural communities around you to record their stories. That's way more likely to get that grant funding than just to say, I interview interesting people. Well, who's to decide what's interesting and what's not, But if you say that my podcast is a talking head sort of format, two people, it's me as the host, and I'm going to record and talk to elders in rural communities around this area to record their stories. That's way more specific. And so that's that niching down that I was talking about. It really helps you refine your message and refine your content of your podcast. Here's another example. So a podcast about healthy mindset with thought leaders around the world. And yes, there are too many podcasters out there who don't really think about their content. They just leave it so broad open. And there's this is a whole different thing that we could go down. I know we have just got a few more minutes here, but there is a problem, I think, in podcasting itself, where there are too many podcasters who put out a show that are afraid that if they narrow down the description of their podcast too much, that they won't find an audience or that they alienate another audience. So they think that they have to broaden it and sort of be the Amazon, of podcasts, which is just, we are for everyone. Who's your podcast for? A lot of people will just say, it's for anyone who enjoys my content. Well, that's nice, but it's so non-specific that now the majority of the population is not interested because you haven't hit on any of the things that they're interested in. There are too many people that are saying we are for everyone. So let's say that your podcast is as vague as a podcast about healthy mindset. We're talking to thought leaders around the world. And the grant you find, this is one that's really open right now. This is the Grays Harbor Community Foundation, and it's offering up to $30,000 for improving the quality of life for its citizens. Okay. That grant description is kind of vague, but they do that on purpose because they're not closing off their ideas for, non-conventional, projects to be, presented to them. So they're saying $30,000 for improving the quality of life for its citizens. That's that could be anything. And so let's say that you revise your idea for your podcast that you're going to propose. Okay, so we take that podcast about healthy mindset, talking to thought leaders, and you say it's a podcast about healthy mindset with leaders in several areas of wellness, in specifically Grays Harbor, Washington, because the grant says that it is for citizens of Grays Harbor community, right? So that's a very specific place that is trying to fund. I found one recently that I'm helping a podcaster with. She's an entrepreneur. She has a podcast that is helping entrepreneurs learn about how to grow their following with newsletters. I mean, it covers a lot of different things, and there's just one of those sort of vague type of description podcasts. but there is a St. Louis, Missouri organization that has a big grant that's open, that says that the grant project has to benefit entrepreneurs in the area of St. Louis. That doesn't mean that you have to live there. Okay, so that's another myth. You don't have to live in those organizations, or the areas of that organization that it specifically serves, in order to serve them, right? So if you're producing a podcast, that can be consumed anywhere. It doesn't obey, state lines. It doesn't obey international lines. A podcast is out there for anyone to consume. So, but if you make it specifically for those citizens of St. Louis or Grays Harbor here, if you're making it specifically for, they're willing to fund you. But let's say that you proposed an idea for this very specific area, and somebody from Grays Harbor also proposes the same idea. Then it's sort of, they kind of have to go with the person who's more local, just because they want to help local. But if you're the experts and you don't live in a location, you see a grant for a specific location, go ahead and apply for that, because they are really, really, really likely to help fund you. There's a reason why there's a grant out there to help develop entrepreneurs in a certain area. It's because they don't have the resources in that area to help develop them. And so if you're the expert and you have a podcast about that and you can help, then absolutely you need to apply for these grants. Okay. Third example here. I know we're running out of time. Podcast that interviews filmmakers. Okay, so let's say this is another grant that's out there. The Legal Foundation of Washington offers $50,000 for projects that promote race equality. Okay, that doesn't sound like it fits your initial idea, but you revise your idea to a podcast that interviews and highlights the up and rising filmmakers of color. Boom. You changed your whole, it doesn't radically change your whole format. It kind of fits the format that you were already doing, but it also helps that organization reach the audience that it's trying to reach. Okay, so what to do after you receive a grant? When you're rewarded with the grant, it's time to collaborate and celebrate. But don't spend a dime of the grant funding anywhere other than where you propose it to. We've gone over that several times. I'm just reiterating for the billionth time, because it's really, really important to spend the money. It can't go towards your car note. It can't go towards your apartments, or your electric bill or anything like that. Like, it has to go towards whatever you said you needed the funding for, right? You'll be matched with a bookkeeper or administrator in most cases. Some organizations are, like I said, they're just hands off. They drop it in our lap and they say, good luck working with this podcaster. Please let us know when you're done. Or then there's others that are like really on top of it, and they want to get receipts back of what did you spend. Okay, so fiscal partner opportunities. So we as an organization, we've worked with several major grantors to help podcasters get funding, and the benefit you receive, if you wanted to work with us, of course, like I said, we're an organization that specifically helps podcasters, and so that is our mission and vision. It kind of makes sense that we are able to pay more attention to your project than another nonprofit. If you want to go with another nonprofit, absolutely fine, perfectly fine. If it fits you, if you know somebody that runs a nonprofit organization, you can absolutely do that. But there's a level of trust that we already have with grantors, considering in the realm of podcasting. It doesn't cost you anything. And you have an accountability partner, which is always a plus. You have access to more resources because we have coaches and people to help you get your podcast going if you hit a roadblock. And we help you, look for grants if you need help doing that. I know I didn't put it on here, but another way of looking for grants is a lot of public libraries now, I've recently found, will pay for a subscription to those, like Instrumental or one of those types of websites that lists podcasts, that are paid subscription. If you have a library card, you're able to go on the computers and look up any of those grants for free, see how much that organization gave last year, what kind of programs it was funding last year, and see if that matches anything that you could propose for them. So what do we get out of it? Again, APC operates off of grants, and we are of our own. We're awarded so that we can keep helping podcasters like you. When we help get you grant funding, the only thing that we ask for are, name us in your show notes, be a speaker at one of our events if possible, or online, kind of like what we're doing for PodUp, and potentially hire someone from our network. We are really trying to raise, like I said initially, the amount of podcast talent that is here in this part of the US, which typically kind of gets ignored, and potentially collaborate for an event that we don't host. Okay, finally got the questions.
Perfect. And for anybody who has to drop off at the top of the hour, don't worry. This will be posted to YouTube so that you can actually hear the answers to all the questions. So don't stress about that. But one of the questions that just came in, I'll ask first, is how do you want people to connect with you, Ty? Do you want them to do it through the website or email, which I will also put? Oh, perfect. And I will make sure this is in the follow-up email so that everybody has that information in case you can't capture that right here. All right, jump into the other questions. Are there tax obligations if you get a grant?
No. So the grants are tax free because they're coming from a nonprofit organization or they're coming from the government. If it's coming from an individual who's not registered as a nonprofit, then there are some tax implications there where it's kind of like if you if you've been in like a contest where you've seen like where you win a car, right? So you win the car, but you got to pay the sales tax on that. That's the only time whenever like it affects your taxes. Otherwise, you are receiving tax-free funding from this grant from a nonprofit or from a government.
Great. And if you're awarded a grant and then, say for your project later down the road, you realize you're going to need more funding, are you able to adjust the budget, or are you stuck within the constraints of that original grant?
So you're kind of signing a contract in the beginning. So like I said, make sure that you have a definitive amount that you need for each one of the things. That way, so let's say that you get a quote from an editor and they say, well, I'm going to charge you, well, let's just say $1,500. Okay. Well, $1,500 per episode, right? That's for me to go in and edit your episode completely and so that you have a completely finished product in the end. And then you get the grant funding and then you go back and they say, well, actually, I kind of have to up my charges. I need to be paid $2,000. That can't happen unless you're willing to throw in the extra $500. You've allotted for $1,500. So if that editor won't do that anymore for that amount, find somebody else who will. But you are held to spending the amounts of money in the way that you propose. So yes, but it doesn't mean that you're stuck with whoever you quoted for that in the beginning, if that makes sense.
Got it. And then you had mentioned when searching for grants, if you're using Google, there could be millions and millions of grants out there. If you're using Google to look for these, is it about asking the right questions and pairing of keywords to find that kind of information?
Yeah, for sure. And there's no, crack the code type of situation here. You don't have to hack the system. Just putting grant for, and there's kind of 3 keywords that I use whenever I'm looking for new grants that I'm not aware of yet. And I will have grant for blank, fill in the blank here of like what subject matter you're trying to cover. If it's entrepreneurism, if it is historical preservation, if it is cosmetology, like I was talking about, or medical situation, whatever your podcast is about. So grant for that, and then either 3 words, either programming, education, or a project. So any one of those 3 words. If it doesn't work for one, I'll replace that word with the project. If the project doesn't work, I'll replace it with programming or the other one. And you'll usually find all kinds of podcasts. You'll be surprised by all the different organizations that you find that you never knew even existed out there that have grant funding that's available out there for it too. And each one of these has sandbox grants, which are sort of open all year round. So opposed to the ones that are seasonal. So seasonal podcast or seasonal, grants. Let's say that they open on September 3rd and you have until October 9th to apply for this grant. So sandbox are just open year round, 365, and they're just looking for projects to be, proposed to them. They have a certain amount of money that they want to spend. Let's say that they have, $500,000 in their accounts that they want to go towards, grants, but they're just waiting for programs and, projects like yours, your podcast that you're going to propose, they're waiting for that proposal to hit their inbox before they start looking at how much can we, spend for that. So the sandbox grants are great, and they're non-specific. You have a lot more playing room. That's why there's sandbox grants.
And if you were to get, say, that 500,000, which sounds pretty amazing,
Right.
if you only spent 400,000 of it, whatever the terms or period for that grant were, do you have to return it, or are you forced to spend it?
Spend it. I mean, why would you not? if you've got the extra money, why would you not spend it? That's why it's really important to get accurate numbers whenever you do quote for all the different things that you need for your podcast in the beginning for that budget sheet. And then let's say that for your marketing, here's something I'm considering now, because Facebook just came out and they said that they're going to change their terms of service, right? And so they're no longer doing fact checking. They are going to go with community notes, and that they're going to allow a lot more freedom of speech, outspoken type. Anyways, so there's a lot of great things that can come out of it. There's a lot of bad things that can come out of that. We saw how that went with X, but what we're thinking on is, because a lot of people are still advertising with Facebook ads, does this help or hurt us? And so let's say in the beginning you say that you needed $5,000 of your grant to go towards Facebook ads to make people aware of your podcast. Well, depending on how this goes, there may not be enough of an audience on Facebook, or it might be the wrong audience on Facebook now, because it's going to dynamically change everything about how the program works. If that changed, that terms of service happened between the time that you proposed that and the time that you got your money, then you can adjust your marketing budget. You can usually work with whoever it is, the administrator that that is working with you, and say, well, rather than using the full $5,000 on Facebook ads, I want to use $2,500 on Facebook ads, and then $2,500 on Google ads. And they'll, I would say 99.9% of the time will be like, oh yeah, that's perfectly fine, because that's still within marketing. But if you were going to say, I want to spend $2,500 on Facebook ads and then $2,500 on a new camera, well, those are two very, very completely different things, and they're not going to allow that.
Gotcha. And so, you've got this $500,000 grant. Does the grantor pick the nonprofit, or excuse me, I'm phrasing that wrong. Does the nonprofit pick a fiscal partner, or how does that work once you've got the money? Who's deciding the nonprofit? If it's APC, is it the person giving the money or the person receiving the money?
Are you talking about the fiscal partner in between?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So the nonprofit fiscal partner between is part, if they require that, it's going to be part of your application process. So it'll be well before you even get the money that you have to, in your application process, it'll say, who is your nonprofit fiscal partner that you're working with? If it's APC, or if it's, American Heart Association, whoever it is that you're working with, making sure that you name that organization that you're going to be working with. If they approve that, then that is definitely your nonprofit fiscal partner. It can't switch. But yeah, you're sort of choosing that on your own in the beginning of who it is that you're going to be working with, and make sure you definitely talk to those organizations of saying, hey, will you be my nonprofit fiscal partner? Don't just volunteer somebody without having something, an agreement between you two before you even apply.
Got it. And this is probably a really good question for us to end on. For APC specifically, is there criteria on the type of podcasters or podcasts that you work with?
There's not a whole lot of criteria. So we work with a lot of different types of podcasts. Just to name a few. So there's a lot of there are a lot of recovery podcasts. There are podcasts that, like I said, I told you about the Kate, who's working on something that's very specific in medical studies, but it's about something very specific that a lot of people deal with, that it would improve their lives if they knew more about this subject. And so I would say it helps getting a grant, And we are more passionate about podcasts that have a reason. And so if your podcast helps a group of people in any way, if you're improving their lives in some way, then we definitely want to help in that area. And you're more likely to get a grant because if you're helping people, all these nonprofit organizations, they serve someone. So if your podcast is making those people that they serve their lives better, then you're more likely to get a grant. And yeah, absolutely want to help get you boosted.
Awesome. So this has been really, really great information. I know it's been helpful for myself. I think it's been helpful for all of the attendees. Ty, thank you so much for spending this time with us and letting us run over a little bit.